Bill, a struggling farmer, spent his life nurturing his land, never knowing it would be the reason he was dragged to the ground. 30 minutes after sunrise, police arrived with a court order to seize his farm. But just as they began tearing through his fields, a helicopter appeared on the horizon. Stepped out a group of army generals. Life was about to surprise him in the most unexpected way. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to share another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. The sun brushed the edges of Bill Thompson's farm, lighting up the fields he'd loved for 50 years. At 72, Bill carried a quiet pride in his chest, the kind that came from knowing his crops fed more than just his table. Every month, he'd pack up crates, golden corn, juicy tomatoes, plump squash, and send them off to military bases across the country. It started decades ago, a way to honor the soldiers who kept the world safe. He'd stand by the truck, hands rough from work, watching each load roll out with a little nod. "For you folks," he'd whisper, voice thick with feeling, like he was sending a piece of himself along too. Those shipments were his gift, his thank you, stitched into every stalk and root he grew. Then the day would begin, soft and steady, the way Bill liked it. He'd step out of his old farmhouse, the porch boards groaning under his boots, and pause there, breathing deep. The air smelled of damp earth and green life, wrapping him in a calm that felt like home. His eyes, crinkled from years of sun, would sweep over the fields, rows of corn standing tall, tomato vines heavy with red, squash peeking out like treasures. He'd start walking slow and sure, letting his fingers graze the leaves as he passed. At the corn, he'd stop, bending low to check the husks, their silk brushing his palm like a friend's touch. "Growing strong," he'd say softly, a smile tugging his lips. Over by the tomatoes, he'd kneel, knees popping, and cradle one in his hands, its warmth sinking into his skin. He'd pull a weed or two, dirt smudging his faded jeans, then stand up, stretching his back as the sun climbed higher. It was hard work, but it filled him up. Every leaf, every quiet moment, a life he'd built with his own two hands. The day rolled forward like it always did, the rhythm of the farm steady and familiar. Bill lifted a crate of corn into the back of his old pickup, the wood rough against his palms. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the edge of his sleeve, and glanced at the horizon. The sky stretched wide and blue, but clouds gathered far off, smudges of gray creeping in slow. "Storm's comin'," he muttered, rubbing his thumb over a scratch on the truck bed. His voice barely stirred the air, lost in the rustle of leaves. He lingered a moment, fingers trailing the edge of the crate like he was reassuring the corn it'd be all right. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and soil clung heavy, the dim light softening the lines of old tools hanging on the walls. Bill traced a hand over a rusted shovel handle, the wood worn smooth from decades of use. A photo, taped to a wooden beam, caught his eye. His grandson Tom, in uniform, grinning wide, arms slung around a fellow soldier. Bill's chest tightened, throat prickling. "Hope you're eating good out there, kid," he said, voice low and uneven. The rain tapped steadily against the windows, streaking down the glass in thin, winding trails. Bill sat in his kitchen, hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee mug, his eyes lost somewhere beyond the fields. The storm didn't bother him much. Storms came and went, same as seasons, same as life. The fields would drink up the water, and by morning, everything would smell clean and new again. Then a knock rattled the front door. Bill frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not in weather like this. The knock came again, louder this time, more impatient. With a quiet grunt, Bill pushed himself up from the table, grabbing his flannel and draping it over his shoulders as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, 3 people stood on the porch, rain dripping from their clothes and pooling around their shoes. One woman stood at the front, her face flushed with cold, hair plastered against her cheeks. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then lifted her chin. "You Bill Thompson?" she asked, voice sharp against the hum of rain. Bill didn't answer right away. He just looked at them, their wet clothes, their scuffed boots, then slowly stepped back, leaving the door open just enough to talk through. "Depends who's askin'," he muttered, voice like gravel. The woman straightened her posture, smoothing her soaked jacket as if that might dry it. "We're with an organization called Protect the Soil," she said, her words clipped. "We've been monitoring local farms, and we need to talk to you about your shipments." Bill didn't blink. "What about 'em?" The woman glanced at the man beside her, who shifted uncomfortably, then turned back to Bill. "You've been sending crops across state lines without proper clearance," she said, her voice low but cutting. "That's illegal." Bill's hand rested on the edge of the door, fingers tightening against the wood. He looked past the woman, out toward the fields, where the corn stalks bent gently under the weight of the rain, his crops, his land, the life he'd tended to longer than these folks had probably been alive. "I send food to military bases," he said, voice steady but heavy. "For soldiers. Folks who fought for this country, not for profit, just to give back." The woman's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't change the law," she snapped. "You could be spreading disease through unchecked produce, putting people at risk." Bill let out a slow breath through his nose, his gaze lowering to the wet porch boards beneath their feet. "I inspect every crop myself," he muttered. "Every crate, every bushel. Ain't never sent out a bad ear of corn in 50 years. The woman huffed, crossing her arms over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. "Sentiment doesn't excuse recklessness," she said. "And you don't get to decide what's safe. That's not your job." Bill looked at her then, really looked. Her wet clothes, her shaking hands, the sharpness in her voice that sounded more tired than angry. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, rain pattering against the porch roof, filling the silence between them. Finally, he nodded, just once, slow. "You done?" he asked, voice low and worn. The woman wiped rain from her face, eyes burning with something sharper than anger. Conviction. "You think this is over, Mr. Thompson?" she snapped, stepping closer, her boots sinking into the mud. "Your chemicals are poisoning the water supply. People are getting sick. Kids, Bill. And you're out here acting like some kind of hero?" Bill straightened, rain streaking down the deep lines of his face. His fingers flexed at his sides, dirt caking his nails. "I grow food," he said, voice low but steady. "I feed families, soldiers. I don't hurt people." The woman let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe not on purpose, but intent doesn't change the damage." She jabbed a finger toward the fields. "We have soil samples, water tests. If you won't listen now, we'll come back. With proof. And with people. The whole town, if we have to." Bill's jaw tightened, his throat thick. The rain fell harder as he watched her turn on her heel, the group of activists splashing through puddles back to their cars without a second glance. He exhaled sharply, then slowly followed them toward their car, stepping into the rain as water slid off the brim of his hat. He stood there long after their taillights faded, boots buried in the mud, shoulders heavy as the storm swallowed the horizon. His heart beat heavy, a dull ache beneath his ribs. The woman's words stuck to him like burrs, sharp and persistent. Poisoning the water? Hurting kids? The accusations echoed in his chest, louder than the storm. He wiped his face with a rough hand, smearing mud across his cheek, then turned back toward the house. Inside, the farmhouse felt quieter than usual. The clock on the wall ticked slow and steady, and the scent of damp earth lingered as Bill kicked off his boots. He moved through the kitchen with the weight of the day dragging at his limbs, pausing by the sink to stare out the window. The fields stretched out, drenched and shimmering, every row a testament to his life's work. But now, doubt gnawed at him. He thought of the chemicals he used, the fertilizers, the treatments for pests. They kept the crops healthy, kept the yield high enough to send crates to the bases. Was he blind to what those things might be doing to the land? To the people? Bill sat down at the kitchen table, his hands rough against the worn wood. He traced a crack that ran through the surface, remembering how his wife, June, used to run her fingers over it too. "Nothing stays perfect," she'd say with a soft smile. "But that don't mean it stops being good." Bill closed his eyes, her voice lingering like a ghost in the quiet. He wished she were here now, to steady him, to help him untangle the mess sitting heavy in his chest. The next morning the storm had passed, but the sky stayed gray, clouds hanging low like the weight in Bill's heart. He grabbed his tools and headed into the fields, needing the work to clear his mind. He checked the soil, crouching low to crumble it between his fingers. It smelled rich, alive, the way it always had. But doubt lingered, whispering that maybe he wasn't seeing the damage. Maybe he didn't want to. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and looked toward the horizon. He knew one thing for certain. The woman would be back. And this time, she wouldn't come alone. The next day, Bill kept his head down and worked. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting long shadows across the fields, but the brightness didn't touch him. He pruned the tomato vines, checked the squash, and let the rhythm of the farm steady his breathing. But it didn't quiet the nagging weight in his chest, the feeling that something worse was coming. By late afternoon, that feeling turned real. Bill heard voices, not the usual chatter of birds or the rustling of wind through the corn, but people, loud, angry. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the driveway where a group had gathered by the fence. His heart sank as he recognized a few of his neighbors, mixed in with faces he didn't know. "Bill!" called out Frank, the man who lived a mile down the road. His voice carried an edge that made Bill's stomach knot. Bill stepped closer, stopping just short of the gate. "What's going on?" he asked, voice low and steady. A woman he didn't recognize shoved a crumpled paper against the fence. "Seen this?" she snapped. Bill took it, smoothing the wrinkles with shaking fingers. It was a poster. Bright red letters screaming out the words, "Toxic crops. Stop Bill Thompson's farm." Below that, a picture of his fields, twisted to look barren and diseased, his name printed at the bottom like a brand of shame. "They're plastered all over town," Frank said, voice heavy with accusation. "Folks are scared to buy anything from your land. Say you're poisoning people, Bill." Bill felt the ground tilt, the weight of it all pressing down like a collapsing roof. He swallowed hard, the poster trembling in his hand. "You know me," he said, looking at Frank, then at the others. "You know what this farm means. I ain't ever done wrong by anyone." A younger man, maybe one of the city folks, crossed his arms. "Doesn't matter what you say. People trust what's in front of them. And right now, they see you as a threat." Bill's throat tightened, words catching there like stones. He looked at his neighbors, searching their faces for the years of trust they'd built. But all he saw was doubt. The woman who handed him the poster shook her head. "They're planning a protest," she said, "here at your farm tomorrow." Bill rubbed a hand over his face, the roughness scraping against the weariness in his bones. He looked past them out at his fields, rows of life he'd tended with love and care. It felt like someone had set fire to everything he'd built, and he couldn't even see the flames. The fallout came faster than Bill could have imagined. The day after the group showed up at his gate, flyers littered the town square. Bold letters screamed accusations, unsafe farming practices, health hazard, and protect your families. At the diner where Bill used to grab his morning coffee, people whispered when he walked in. The grocery store clerk, who used to chat with him about the weather, suddenly couldn't meet his eye. It spread like wildfire. The activists held meetings, stirring fear, convincing folks that Bill's methods were dangerous. Bill tried to fight back. He drove into town, stood in front of crowds, and told them the truth. He explained how he tended each crop by hand, how he never used anything that would harm the soil or the people eating his food. But the doubt had already sunk in. "Maybe he doesn't know he's hurting us," one man said. "I heard he won't change his methods. Too stubborn," another muttered. Bill stood there, heart pounding, watching the faces he'd known for decades turn cold. He drove home that night with a weight in his chest so heavy it hurt to breathe. Within days, the impact hit like a hammer. Local markets rejected his produce. Crates of tomatoes sat untouched in the barn. Corn, once golden and proud, wilted in the fields. The squash started rotting in sacks, the smell of decay seeping into the wood of the storage shed. Bill watched it all happen, helpless. He wasn't a rich man, never cared to be. Selling his crops was enough to keep the farm running, to keep the lights on and food on his table. But now? The bank account drained fast. He stopped fixing things around the house. The old tractor sputtered, and he let it sit. The porch boards sagged deeper, creaking louder under his boots. One evening, as the sun bled out over the horizon, Bill sat on his porch with his head in his hands. His fingers, rough and cracked from years of work, dug into his scalp. The farm he'd built, the life he'd grown from the ground up, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He didn't know where it had come from. He didn't know what he'd done to deserve this. Then, a week after the storm, the final blow landed. A letter, stamped by the county court, arrived in his rusted mailbox. Bill opened it with shaking hands, the paper crisp and sharp against his skin. Cease all farming operations immediately. Pending investigation into agricultural safety violations. Further notice to follow. Bill read it twice. Then again. His chest caved in, and he lowered the letter to his lap, staring out at the fields that stretched to the horizon. The fields he could no longer tend. The sky dimmed, the last light fading. Bill just sat there, the letter limp in his hand, feeling like a ghost in his own life. The news spread like wildfire, and with each passing day, Bill felt himself aging faster. His back slumped, and his hands trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. The farm, once his pride, now felt like a cage. He barely stepped outside anymore, dreading the sharp words from passing neighbors or the judgmental glances from people driving by. But that morning, something unusual happened. Bill sat by the window, staring out at the empty fields. The sky, heavy with gray clouds, matched the weight in his chest. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a figure walking up the dirt path. A man in uniform. A soldier. Bill's breath hitched. His first thought was dread. Maybe the soldier had come to scold him too, another person to tell him he'd ruined the land or endangered the town. Maybe the government had sent someone to make sure he stayed off the fields. Still, Bill pushed himself to his feet. If this was another blow, he'd take it standing. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, feeling the cool breeze brush against his skin. The soldier, tall and sturdy, turned toward him, but there was no anger in his face, only concern. "Bill?" the soldier called, voice steady but gentle. Bill nodded, clearing his throat. "That's me." The soldier took another step closer, peering at Bill with a faint smile. "Hey, you remember me?" he asked, tilting his head. "Last year you sent a batch of your best crops to our base. For the soldiers. I helped load the truck myself." Bill squinted, recognition slowly dawning. "Wait, Luke?" The soldier grinned. "Yeah, Luke. I was just a recruit back then, but your vegetables got us through some rough days. The guys still talk about it. Fresh food straight from your farm. They all said to tell you hello." Bill's heart skipped. He hadn't thought about that in months. The military had bought vegetables from him during a supply shortage, praising his produce for being hearty and long-lasting. "What brings you here?" Bill asked, rubbing his hand across his face, almost embarrassed. "I'm home for a family ceremony," Luke said, glancing around the worn-down farm. "I just wanted to see you. Make sure you were okay." Bill shifted his weight, glancing down at his boots. He wiped his hands on his jeans, but still didn't say a word. Luke's smile faded as he studied Bill's face. "You okay, Bill?" Luke asked, tilting his head. "You look, I don't know, like something's real wrong." Bill shook his head lightly and turned back toward the house, muttering, "I should get back to work." Luke didn't move. "Hey," he called out gently, "I didn't come to bother you, but if something's happened, maybe I can help." Bill paused, hand on the doorframe, shoulders stiff. "I mean it," Luke pressed. "You helped us. Let me return the favor. Just tell me what's going on." Bill exhaled shakily. his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't help, Luke." He turned around slowly, his face tight with the weight of everything he'd carried alone. "They've turned the whole town against me," he said, voice breaking. "People stopped buying my crops. Say they're dangerous. Flyers all over town. Court notice delivered to my door. It's all falling apart, and I don't even know where to start fixing it." Luke's jaw tightened, eyes darkening with concern. He looked out at the empty fields, the stacks of unsold sacks, then back at Bill. "Why would they think your crops are dangerous?" Bill shrugged helplessly. "Lies. People who don't understand what I do here. Those activists." He looked down, voice bitter. "And I can't stop it." Luke rubbed his chin, thinking. "I don't know what all's been said, but I do know this. You've always done right by people, and I swear, Bill, I'm not letting you fight this alone." Bill's chest heaved, emotion welling up, but he swallowed it down. He wanted to believe Luke's words, but all he felt was the ache of everything he'd lost. Still, for the first time in days, he didn't feel completely abandoned. And maybe that was something. The next morning, Bill's eyes fluttered open to the sharp, relentless pounding on his door. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor or the cautious tap of someone bringing bad news. No, this was the kind of knock that echoed authority, the kind that made Bill's chest tighten with dread. He pushed himself up, joints aching like the weight of the world had settled into his bones. The house was eerily quiet, the ticking clock the only sound besides the storm still raging in his heart. He shuffled to the door, hand trembling as he turned the knob. "Mr. Bill Thompson?" an officer barked as soon as the door creaked open. Bill nodded, gripping the doorframe for support. "That's me." The officer shoved a paper into his hand. "Court order. Your farm is being seized." Bill blinked, trying to make sense of the words. "Seized?" His voice cracked. "Why?" "Health code violations. Unsafe crops. The land is being cleared." The officer's tone was flat, devoid of empathy, as if Bill's life was nothing more than another task to check off a list. Before Bill could plead or even fully understand, workers flooded his fields. They ripped out plants with brutal efficiency, tossing them aside like trash. Crops Bill had nurtured for months, kneeling in the soil until his back screamed in protest, now discarded as if they'd never mattered. He stepped onto the porch, barefoot and in tears, watching the destruction. He didn't shout or beg them to stop. What was the point? No one had listened before. Bill sank to his knees, his body shaking with silent sobs. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside him only grew stronger. Then, a low, distant rumble. It grew louder, vibrating through the ground, until even the workers paused, looking up in confusion. A helicopter appeared over the horizon, the thudding blades slicing through the gray sky. It circled once before lowering, landing right in the middle of Bill's torn-apart farm. The officers tensed, hands hovering near their holsters. The workers stepped back, dirt-streaked hands shielding their faces from the swirling dust. The door of the helicopter swung open. Out stepped a young man in uniform, Bill's grandson, Andrew Thompson. "Grandpa!" he called, sprinting toward Bill and lifting him to his feet. His eyes, sharp and full of concern, scanned Bill's tear-streaked face. "Are you okay?" Bill clutched his grandson, shaking. "What? What are you doing here?" "I called him," a familiar voice said. Luke stepped forward, his face streaked with sweat, eyes burning with resolve. He placed a reassuring hand on Bill's back, steadying the old man. Bill looked between Luke and Andrew, tears blurring his vision. You both came for me?" Andrew tightened his grip on Bill's shoulders, his voice thick with emotion. "Of course we did, Grandpa. You thought we'd let them take everything from you?" Before Bill could respond, the handcuffed old woman, her face lined with desperation, suddenly fell to her knees. "Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just needed the land. We were struggling, and we thought—" She lifted her pleading eyes to Bill. "Please forgive me. I'm an old woman like you. Let me go." Bill's frail body trembled, and for a moment, the compassion in his heart flickered to life. His lips parted, the weight of his lifelong kindness making him hesitate. But Andrew stepped in front of Bill, his jaw clenched. "No," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "You ruined my grandfather's life. You made him doubt himself. You made him feel worthless." His eyes burned with protective fury. "You don't get to walk away from that." The woman flinched, bowing her head in shame as the officers lifted her to her feet and escorted her to a police car. Bill sagged into Andrew, his chest heaving with quiet sobs. Luke knelt beside him, his voice gentle. "You don't have to forgive people who break you, Bill. You deserve peace, not more pain." Bill wiped his face, his fingers trembling. I don't understand why they hated me so much. I just wanted to take care of my farm." Andrew cupped his grandfather's face, his voice breaking. "They didn't hate you, Grandpa. They just saw you as an easy target." He swallowed hard, eyes shining with tears. "But you're not alone. Not anymore." The cleanup crew arrived to assess the damage to the land, and the government official promised full restoration of Bill's farm, with extra support for future crop cycles. The officers left, and the chaos faded into quiet as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Later, Bill, Andrew, and Luke sat on the porch, the air still carrying the scent of broken soil. The horizon glowed with shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the tattered field. Luke leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "I'm just glad we caught them in time, but Andrew, you made this happen. If you hadn't acted so fast, they might have destroyed everything." Andrew shook his head, watching his grandfather with soft eyes. "Luke, you're the one who called me. You did the hard part." Bill looked between them, voice barely above a whisper. "You both saved me." Andrew's face tightened, and he reached for Bill's hand, holding it carefully, as if afraid it might break. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me you were struggling?" Bill glanced at the broken field, voice heavy with regret. "You're busy with your life. I didn't want to burden you." Andrew's breath hitched, and he blinked hard to keep the tears from falling. "You're never a burden," he whispered fiercely. "You're my family, my hero. I don't care if I'm on the other side of the world. If you need me, I'll come." Luke nodded, his voice steady. "Same goes for me, Bill. You're not just some farmer. You're the reason people like us have food on our tables. That matters." Bill's chest ached, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't from grief. It was from the overwhelming swell of love, of gratitude, of hope. He squeezed Andrew's hand, his voice fragile but sure. "I think maybe I'll plant new seeds tomorrow." Andrew smiled, resting his head on Bill's shoulder. "I'll help you." Luke kicked his feet up on the railing, grinning. "I guess I can get my hands dirty, too." They sat in silence as night fell, the stars twinkling one by one above the farm that had survived every storm, just like Bill. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Bill didn't feel old. He didn't feel broken. He felt loved. He felt home. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.